Kia ora, this is Liz. Welcome to Dames Ablaze. If you haven't watched my intro video yet, can I suggest you go do that now so you know what we're up to? Otherwise, grab your Bible, dig on in, and we'll dig on in, sorry. Today we're looking at John chapter 9, verses 3 to 5, and I will read them to you now. Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." Last week I told you there was speculation about a full stop in the middle of verse 3, which I allowed last week. This week I checked 23 of the more common translations and found that 16 have a comma, 12 use either a colon or a semicolon, and 5 put a full stop. There is some debate then, as I said, about which punctuation should be used. In some ways, of course, it doesn't matter which way it goes. The only thing making it one sentence does, apart from making it rather a long sentence, is link the man's blindness with the works of God being revealed in him, and thereby making God out to be a sadist in the eyes of atheists. We covered that last week, of course, so we won't rehash that ground. The important bit is that neither the man nor the parents were guilty of a sin that caused the man's blindness. Not that they weren't guilty of any sin at all, because no one's quite that perfect, just that their sins hadn't been the cause of the calamity. It's just one of those things that God was now going to use to prove a point. He didn't set the man up in order to make that point. He's just going to use all things, pull them together and make something good out of them, as is his wont, his right, and how he normally acts. So, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but. On the contrary, or instead, or nevertheless, the Greek word for but means otherwise, or on the other hand. In other words, Jesus is saying, here's the third option that you guys didn't even consider. And that option is that the works of God, hold it, what works, I wondered. Creative works in this case, as I told you last week. Jesus isn't just going to be curing the blindness, he'll also have to supernaturally get the brain rewired to accept the light that's about to flood in, and to give the man some understanding of what it all means. To have some library of knowledge downloaded so that this blind man has some concept of what he's seeing. Jesus will heal this man of his blindness in order that the works of God can be revealed. So to reveal something is to make it visible, to make it known, to manifest it even. God's works are about to be shown up, as they are in any man or woman who comes to him even today seeking help, recovery or solace for emotional pain. That doesn't mean that every crippled man gets up and walks, or every blind woman starts seeing again. When the paralysed man was put down through the roof by his mates, the first thing Jesus did was forgive his sins, not heal him. Forgiveness of sins is always paramount. Bringing the broken and wounded back into community is more important than seeing people healed. Often what's really hurt is the heart, not the body. Once the heart is healed, the pain of the body just isn't important anymore. God's works are first and foremost about redemption, and that doesn't mean he always heals disabilities or even cancer, for instance. To us, God healing someone is to cure the ill or fix the disability. To God, healing is dealing with what's really broken in a person and fixing that. And that may not be their disability. Their disability might just be the thing that God uses for his glory. In 1818 France, a young boy was mucking around with his father's tools when one of them flicked up and caught him in the eye. The eye became inflamed and the inflammation spread to the other eye, leaving this boy completely blind by the age of 6. At the age of 16, he became a student at the National Institute for Blind Youth in Paris. At that time, the blind learned to read by tracing raised letters, like the whole letter. This was extremely difficult, and not many managed to learn it. There was also at that time a man named Charles Babbage, who had developed a method of silent communication for soldiers in the trenches at night, embossed dots that represented sounds. The army wasn't very impressed by the raised dots, but our blind teen was. His name was Louis Braille, and he took Babbage's concept and turned it into the alphabet that all blind people are familiar with. God didn't heal Louis's blindness, but his works were manifested in it. Without Louis, blind people might well still be trying to read by running their fingers over embossed letters. Now we look at this story and we might concentrate on the cause of Louis's blindness. The cause of it was senseless and would probably not have happened if medicine had been up to scratch. But if we concentrate only on the cause, we'd miss God's works being manifest. When the disciples looked at the blind man, it stirred a theological debate. Who sinned? An age-old problem, worth discussing at some point, I suppose. But when Jesus looked at the man, he didn't get entangled in theological cobwebs. I have to admit, I stole that one. It was a really good phrase. Theological cobwebs, I love it. The disciples were focused on the cause of the man's blindness. Jesus, however, was looking at the purpose in it. What use could be made of it? What goodness could come out of it? Jesus could see a greater purpose in this man born blind. He could see that the Father's works could now be displayed in spectacular fashion that would underline his statement that he was the light of the world. The disciples had the light of the world with them. He was right there. They should have been soaking up everything he said and did, not concerning themselves with the theology of sin. Sometimes it matters why someone is suffering. Sometimes it is a direct result of some sin and it can't be dealt with till the sin is dealt with. But that shouldn't be our main focus. Our main focus isn't the cause for some trouble, but the purpose. The question for us is not where suffering has come from, but what are we to do with it? Jesus takes the suffering and uses it to prove his words about himself, to back up his statement that he is the light. It will be an extremely open miracle. It will be without a doubt a miracle. There's no way the Pharisees, etc. will miss it. It's been done on the Sabbath, for goodness sakes. They'll hear about it, and quick. So it seems to me that the revelation of God's work here might primarily be for those who sought to stone him in the last chapter to prove his words. What better way to illustrate the fact that he was doing God's works than bringing light to a previously dark life? Jesus tells his disciples that he must, or rather in the original, given that the he is plural here, it should read we must. Jesus isn't just going to prove his right to be called the light of the world. He's teaching the disciples something in the process and bringing them into this imperative. We must do the works of him who sent me. They are busy judging the man or his parents. They hadn't even considered healing him. We're all the same. When we hear of disaster or trouble, our first instinct is usually to share the news, not to pray about things. Don't feel condemned. I'm just the same. We could all do better at praying when we hear about troubles. Must is an imperative. The Greek word spelt D-E-I is said die. It means what is an absolute necessity. It has to happen. There are two musts in our lives. One is that nagging, constant need to get on with something that we really don't want to do. For me, that would be exercise. And then there are the musts that become who we are. When Jesus said to the disciples by the well of Jacob, back in chapter 4 of John, that his food was to do the will of his Father, he was talking about a must that was so ingrained that doing it felt like eating food. It brought that same sense of satisfaction to him. I don't know if you guys have a must that would fit into this category. For me, it's teaching, which is why I finally realized that what I should spend the bulk of my time doing is teaching, because that's mainly, though not exclusively, what God created me for. It's what comes most naturally when someone's in trouble. My first instinct is to teach something. I have to usually sit on that because it's not usually appropriate. We must work the works of him who sent me. There he goes again, speaking in riddles. Why do you suppose Jesus talks like this? Why doesn't he just say, I've got to do the works my Father sent me here to do? No, it's him who sent me. What is that? I think he does it to constantly shift the attention off himself and onto the Father. I mean, you have to think about it, right? Okay, who was he who sent him? Right, good, okay. Anyway, slight digression. It's obvious what works did that were of the Father, right? He knew, and it's obvious to us, but how can we be sure if our works are of the Father? How do we know when we're actually doing the works of God? Sometimes it's obvious, right? I mean, if you're teaching the Word of God or you're having a conversation about the Lord, that seems intuitively to be the works of God. But What about just normal, average, everyday life, when it's all just the humdrum of daily existence? Does that mean we're not doing the works of God? Well, that depends on whether or not you do all things as unto the Lord. Even cleaning the house can be a work of God if you look at it the right way. We're called to steward everything we have. That means we're to take care of it. Cleaning the house is one way of taking care of it. So then, even in the duster and the vacuum cleaner, the works of God can be found. We must work the works of God. We get that, right? But what about the next bit? To the disciples, Jesus adds, while it is day, which is much as made by commentators about it being evening and the sun going down and whatnot. But it can't be evening, at least not yet, right? It's the Sabbath when Jesus heals this man. The Sabbath ends at sundown. So it could be heading that way, I suppose, but it can't be near enough for this analogy to have been prompted by the dying of the light on the horizon. It's a lovely picture, but it doesn't actually stack up. The works of God must be done while it is still day. So does this mean we can only do God's work in the daylight hours? In some ways, back in Jesus' day, that probably was literally true. I mean, they only had candles, and candles don't give that much light. These days we have no excuse. No, I'm being far too literal. Of course I am. Jesus contrasts day and night here. We need to work while it's day because night is coming up fast. Let's dispense with the simple literal day-night analogy and find the deeper meaning, because there is one. Work while it is day, for night is coming. It's a proverb of sorts, isn't it? We might say, gather the roses while ye may, or make hay while the sun shines. What it means is that there's a window of time when works can be done. That time is not infinite, that the opportunities to preach the gospel collectively or individually will not always be available to us. Collectively, the Church of God has been given time to preach the gospel to a waiting world, and it did that very well for maybe 1,000 years. And then it started to bend with every wind of doctrine. Sometime in the last century, or possibly the century before, the Church watered down the word of God, allowed for sin in the pulpit and the congregation, stopped even talking about sin, and thereby allowed the world to grow ever more darker. We now live in a darker age, where it's harder to speak of God. Even in Western societies which were built on Christian principles, the window has almost closed. It is being cracked further open, not sure for how long. But the interesting thing about that is that it's being cracked open not by Christians, but by non-Christians. The intelligentsia believed that if they got rid of God, they would have peace and tranquility, and utopia would abound. What happened was almost the complete opposite. Without God, the world was a hopeless place, without purpose. And we, intelligent humans that we are, discovered that we actually need hope and purpose. What the intelligentsia found was a void. Into that void stepped another religion, and the one standing up and trying to take that ground at the moment is Islam. Even antagonistic atheists realised that would not be a good thing, and so they're opening the window a little more for Christians to once again speak, and we need to jump. It's day again. We need to be doing the works of God while there is opportunity to do so. The disciples had a window of time in which they could do the works of God. They were driven out of Jerusalem during the writing of the Gospels. Their window of opportunity was not very big at all, and I suspect that our window will not be very wide unless we as Christians start preaching the whole gospel again, which includes the bits about sin. There are other ways to look at the day-night analogy. Some say it has to do with life and death, for instance, or because of verse 5 that it's actually linked to Jesus' life and death. It is true that things got harder after Jesus' death, but it didn't really stop them working. Jesus said that night is coming when no one can work, which sounds rather dire, but it can't relate to the disciples working after Jesus ascends, because they actually worked harder after he seated himself at the right hand of the Father. Personally, I do think it's just about opportunity. We are given opportunities to reach out to people, and we should take them when they arise, not sit on our laurels waiting for another opportunity to arise. We just don't know how many opportunities we'll get to speak to people about Jesus. We don't know when their end will come, or our own, or when they'll close their minds to further discussion. So strike while the iron is hot, when you sense that the iron is hot. That's the tricky bit, of course. How do you know when someone is open to the conversation? The best way to find out is to put out a couple of feelers. Ask people what they think about God or death. Listen and feel your way. Either they will be receptive to further conversation or they will shut it down. Either way, you now know more about that person, and even if they have shut you down, you might just have an inkling on how to pray for them. Paul puts this imperative slightly differently. In his letter to the Ephesians, he wrote, "See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil." Time is precious. It's one of your biggest assets, but we tend to waste an awful lot of it. The apostles lived and died believing Jesus' return was just around the corner, and it drove them to work efficiently and constantly. We live with the idea that his return could be coming, or maybe it won't. It's made Christians a little slack, in my opinion, a little complacent. We assume, I think, that he won't be returning in our lifetimes because, after all, every generation has had thoughts of his return. When World War I broke out, oh, it must be the time for his return. No return. When World War II broke out, same thought, same result. These days, whenever anyone mentions that it could be the return of Christ, I mean, just look at the state of the world, cold water is poured over any thought of it. People kindly point out that they thought the same thing during World War I and World War II. Problem with all of that is that it stops us thinking we've got limited time, and that makes us lazy with the things of God. Hold it, I've got to take a phone call. I don't know if you noticed the pause, but I had to rush away. Sorry, I'm back again. Where was I? So I've got a friend who rings me a lot to check which seal in the book of Revelation we're up to. One phone call, I finally asked him what difference it would make. I said, if I could give you an actual date that I knew for sure Jesus was going to turn up, would it make a difference in your life? He said no, of course, not because he's living a life that God would actually approve of, but because he's an arrogant sod. I love him, but he's an arrogant sod. But actually, the answer for Christians should be no. We should be living, just as the apostles did, with the idea that it could happen any day. If we live with that in mind, we are less likely to be complacent with the things of God, less likely to let opportunities pass us by. As long as I am in the world, Jesus says, I am the light of the world, bringing the whole discourse on being the light to a close here. He had to argue with a lot of prideful, unbelieving leaders to get here, but get here he has. He's about to take away the darkness for this man, start being more open with his disciples about the future crucifixion, and shine a light into the hearts of men. I think right at the start, when he stood up during the feast and said, I am the light of the world, he already knew this beggar was sitting outside waiting. He knew that after he tried to convince, in particular those that wouldn't be convinced, that he would be able to prove his words in this spectacular fashion. The solemnest part of these verses is in verse 4. The night is coming when no one can work. Let that sink in a little. Let it maybe cause a little nervousness. We should be worried that night is coming. Things hang in the balance as we speak. Darkness is trying very hard to have its way, to blind the eyes of all of mankind to the truth, to push us into a darkness that no one in history has lived through before. Sure, there have always been men who dressed as women or women as men. Joan of Arc famously would be one of them. But it's never been true that these people insisted that they were in fact the opposite sex. It's never been possible to make them look so much like the opposite sex that you would be forgiven for not even recognizing the change. It's never been true that we've had to speak lies about them or be thrown in jail. You think I'm kidding? You need only look overseas. In various places, Australia just had a court case go through the courts that demanded that a female-only website allow a biological male to be allowed to subscribe. Prisons in Britain have allowed male rapists to enter female prisons because they declared themselves to be female. People are being fined all over the place for daring to say men can't be women. Will the world fall for this deception? Will we head into Orwell's picture of 1984? He was 50 years too early, but he certainly painted a fairly clear picture of what it might look like. And if you have not read George Orwell's 1984, I highly recommend you do. Will we fall for it, or will we push back? It's almost impossible to tell, but we do have a very large weapon, and it's called prayer. We also have the truth, which we need to hold on to, no matter what. The day is still upon us, but night is closing in fast. Speak the truth. Shame the devil. Don't give in to compassionate lies. There is no compassion in hiding the truth. It is not compassionate to enable people to continue in sins that will ultimately lead them to being in hell for an eternity. That is not compassion. So speak the truth while ye may, and pray, and pray some more. John's Gospel starts with the Word of God. It moves quite swiftly onto the light. Light was the first thing God created. Light is so vital, isn't it? Without light, nothing grows. Plants use it to make food. We need it to make vitamin D. Light is an essential. Jesus is the light, and he is an essential. Night is coming when no man can work. Let's make sure that as night closes in, our light is still shining, that we are beacons of hope in the midst of a hopeless narrative that would tell our young people not to marry, not to bear children, that they are somehow a blight on this planet. Bring hope to the hopeless and shine a little of Jesus' light into this darkening world. I'll leave you with that challenge this week. I pray that you would be blessed and you would be able to find a space that you can shine a little light this week. Ka kite anō, I will see you next week.